but especially for COP, we shouldn't see it in the sphere of contributing to environmentalism or conservation or climate change. It's like this theatrical political event that fulfills this political function rather than actually creating this like environmental impact or change. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. My name is Cody, and I am joined by
Julia Coverdale, and I do lots of archaeology stuff. So, yeah, that's my whole deal.
And my name is Clayton, and I do very little archaeology, if any at all.
Same. Well, good thing today we're talking about conservation and environmentalism.
What a segue.
Yeah, thank you. So we're at least I was kind of inspired to suggest this episode because COP27 recently happened. It was from November 6th, 2022 to November 18th, 2022. And then also COP15, which I think most people know what COP27 is. It's like, the Paris Accords thing. So that's about climate change, basically. And then COP15 is about like the biodiversity version of this. It's a little bit smaller. This year it was in Montreal. It was from December 7th, 2022 to December 19th, 2022. And a little bit later, we'll get into a little bit more of a breakdown about what happened this year at these conferences, what they mean, what are the long-term effects, things like that. And then another inspiration for this episode to talk about conservation and environmentalism, especially in relation to social theory, was to sort of honor the recent death of Bruno Latour, who died October 9th this year, 2022. And I came up with a little blurb about Latour from the chat CBT, just because I thought it would be interesting to try it out and see how it works. And I think it came out with something pretty good. And I was also too lazy to write my own summary. So it gave me Bruno Latour which is kind of interesting because the latest data that this chatbot uses is from 2021. So they don't have anything new. So it still says is, which I thought was quite interesting. But Bruno Latour is a French philosopher and sociologist known for his work on science, technology, and society. He is particularly interested in the ways in which scientific knowledge is produced and disseminated, and the role that social and political factors play in shaping scientific understanding. His work is influenced by a range of philosophical and sociological traditions, including structuralism, post-structuralism, and actor network theory. One of Latour's most influential ideas is the concept of actor network theory, which argues that all social and technological systems are made up of interconnected networks of human and non-human actors. According to this view, there is no clear distinction between nature and society, and all scientific and technological developments are shaped by a complex web of social and material factors. Latour has also written extensively about the relationship between science and politics and the way in which scientific knowledge is used to support or challenge political and social agendas. He has argued that science should be seen as a form of collective action, and that scientists have a responsibility to engage with the broader social and political context in which their work takes place. So already there's kind of maybe some connections to be made just from this quick summary about Latour's work and COP based on the scientific research and political sort of milieu in which COP takes place and the kind of the factors sort of associating this and contributing to this. Yeah, so I guess, Clayton, do you want to give a brief summary about what you thought was most interesting from COP27 maybe?
Julia, do you have anything first?
No, go for it, Clayton.
No.
Yes.
What a good start. Okay, I'll just do it, whatever. Anyway, so none of us were physically at either of the conferences this year because they're expensive to go to. And the COP27 was in Egypt, which is even harder to get to and everything. But so we're relying basically...
Seem a little counterintuitive, wouldn't you think?
Having it in Egypt or...
Like actually traveling to it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm always thinking about that. Like, especially with COP15 this year, because they're criticizing sort of how many, like, few A-listers showed up and basically, the fact that it's kind of a smaller conference. But on the other hand, isn't like that, like, kind of a good thing because there are less people flying. And anyways, yeah, that's always interesting to think about for me.
Which I can see the value, and I can also see obviously the downside of, like, we live in this pandemic world. I almost said post-pandemic, but that seems a bit too optimistic, where we can Zoom everywhere, but there's also, something that gets lost, especially when we're thinking of international politics, governance structures, and everything else. There is something lacking in those. It seems to be either that or people are just more lazy on Zoom.
I'm in the middle of reading this book called The Radical Lumen. It's about the social theorist, Nicholas Luhmann, I have to remember his name, a big proponent of systems theory. And this book's by Hans Georg Müller. I'm probably butchering that. But basically, the author brought forward Luhmann's idea that conferences like COP and other sort of political conferences like the G20 and all of these things, they do have some sort of political effects, but especially for COP, it's really in this separate sphere. We shouldn't see it in the sphere of contributing to environmentalism or conservation or climate change. It's like this theatrical political event that fulfills this political function rather than actually creating this environmental impact or change. And I think that's especially relevant for a lot of the things that happen at COP15. There's a lot of Indigenous protesters because although COP15, they did use language trying to account for the impact and the great stewardship and the great work that has been done by Indigenous groups and how much they contribute to maintaining ecosystems. Although there was some lip service paid to that, there was still a lot of Indigenous groups protesting how they're cut out of a lot of conversations because they're not recognized as these countries. They don't have the same seat at the table as say the US or Canada or whoever's participating.
And I think along with that, there's also this lack of recognition and really dealing with the formations of racism and settler colonialism and all these other issues that have culminated into where we're at today. So it's not just a matter of paying lip service and being we want to recognize and honor the stewardship that a lot of Native peoples have been practicing for generations, and really coming to terms with the radical change that we need in order to really address the ways in which racism and colonialism has brought us to this point, and the ways that it's been invisibilized to allow our current situation to exist and thrive. Our climate is collapsing and there's catastrophe everywhere. And it's not just a matter of saying we want to recognize and honor the stewardship that Native Americans and First Nations people and Indigenous people all throughout the globe have been doing for generations, but actually reconciling with the systems that we have in place that are continuing the exploitation. And even as we're recognizing this in a way that centers ecology and the natural environment, there still must be a recognition and coming to terms with the actual social processes and structures and institutions of oppression that have enabled where we are.
Yeah, for more on that, quick shout out to the For the Wild podcast, because they have so many great guests that talk about these things.
Yeah, I would also say from my experience, especially with Indigenous communities in the Southwest, it's not just that Indigenous people are stewarding climate change action, but it's also that Indigenous people are experiencing a lot of the effects of climate change that we as white settlers are either not experiencing or ignoring, because the weather outside today is a direct result of climate change. I know for the Southwest, especially for the Pueblo and Dene communities, there's lots of activism surrounding fracking, because fracking is such a big commodity in the Southwest. There's so much opportunities to frack for oil, and there's so much land that the Bureau of Land Management leases out to these oil companies that these Indigenous groups are fighting back against, especially in relation to big archaeological sites like Chaco Canyon, which is located in the middle of the Navajo Nation, but then also just the lack of drinkable water and the way that climate change is impacting Indigenous communities is because of white settler colonialism and the ways in which the United States government has forced people on these reservations to live in poverty, basically.
And I think even zooming in at a more granular level, it really illuminates the intersectionality of a lot of these issues, because it's not just fracking or like drilling and all these other things. It's, these locations in which people are being exploited, where you're just like stuck in dormitories or whatever and working at the site that you live on. And then you also have these locations like right at reservations or tribal regions and communities and such. And then you have this proliferation of violence against Indigenous people and the like rampant abuses like rape and sexual assault of Native American women, and like the missing and murdered Native American and Indigenous women. Like that's an entire epidemic on its own, and that's connectedly, that's not a word, connected directly to these realities that we're talking about of corporate and industrial practices that harm the land and the world that we live on. I guess I'm just trying to get at the fact that these aren't isolated issues, but like they actually impact people's everyday lives, like you mentioned, Julia, with like clean water access or even access to healthcare, but also the violences that people experience personally and interpersonally.
Yeah, and also I also don't want us to act like the Biden administration is innocent in the way that they react to Indigenous stewardship, specifically about climate change. I know that maybe, I think it was about a year or two ago, there was it probably would have been a year ago, but it was definitely the Biden administration that reacted to this. There was a protest that the Pueblo and Dene groups that I follow on the internet that protest about all the Chaco Canyon fracking stuff. They were also protesting about clean water access in DC, and received like a very strong militarized reaction from the like National Guard. And there was like several people arrested. And so, we'll hear a lot of like lip service, I think, especially from the Biden administration and just like Democrats as a whole, that is like, look at these Indigenous communities and all they're doing to steward like climate change resistance and everything. But then when these Indigenous communities are actually stewarding and doing activism to change the way that climate change is impacting their communities, the Biden administration and the Democrats are like, nope, we will not be actually listening to you. We will be taking militarized action against you.
Yeah, I think this has a lot of interesting connections to COP15, because one of the major outcomes of COP15 was, it was literally like on the last day they announced all these great things. So for example, one of the things they announced was the 30 by 30 pledge, which is to protect 30% of land and water by 2030, which is kind of sort of a lot of these promises and pledges, as happens at these events, are kind of empty because they don't exactly give all the details. They don't specify. They don't say what 30% of land and water. They don't specify how this is going to be financed, how this is going to be achieved. They're not saying how they're protecting it, because there's so many different statuses. But so like, because of these great outcomes, that's the biggest thing they pointed to, calling it basically a match for the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, which, has had very limited effect in practice. But the biggest thing is that the Democratic Republic of Congo actually objected and refused to like develop and sign these agreements and finalize them. But they were completely like overran, and their complaint was mostly about the lack of funding for developing nations who are especially in Africa. So the COP27, which also happened like very recently, overlapping, was supposed to be the Africa COP, and there was some stuff that happened that focused on Africa and developing nations, but not near as much as was hoped for. And I just think it's really interesting how also at the COP15 is that there's this like sort of silencing of these developing nations who are saying, yes, these things are great. We like these promises. The 30 by 30 thing is cool. We like all these other finance packages and things that they've approved. But it's also just like there's not enough funding coming for developing nations, because they're the ones, especially in Africa, who are bear the brunt in the Amazon, things like that, who are going to bear the brunt of protecting forest conservation and having these carbon sinks and fighting the effects of climate change. And they're also the ones that are experiencing climate change first. Like a lot of nations and like island nations like Kiribati, for example, the Cook Islands, places like this, they're also experiencing the effects of climate change right now very strongly. But none of the, like a lot of these climate accords are giving them limited funding, if any funding at all. So I know, Clayton, you looked into this a lot more. So is there stuff you want to add about that?
Yeah, to go into a little bit more detail, the reason that the Democratic Republic of Congo's dissent was basically rejected was on a technicality of wording. I read quite a few articles just about this whole dynamic and what went down, and it's just very intriguing to me. I don't want to say it seems inconsequential, but in the end, the Democratic Republic of Congo signed on to it. People quote unquote made amends and like things were smoothed over in order to sign the deal. But it is a very problematic dynamic that occurred in which I believe it was China was the one that kind of dismissed the concern in the first place and then pushed to get the agreement signed.
Correct, because China was the one that was like chairing the this specific like event. I don't know what it's called, but they were the ones that were like leading the proceedings basically. So they had to say, okay, this is finished, or it's not finished yet. We need to talk about this more.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, it's just the dynamic in which you have one of the global superpowers dismissing the concerns of one of the like poorest countries in the world economically. For a little background, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been going through a lot of conflict over the past generations and decades. They have a lot of violence internally between different militia groups and different wars that have taken place, and then also outbreaks of diseases like Ebola were really detrimental to the country. And then COVID was very detrimental, unsurprisingly, as it was throughout much of the world. But in one of these places that has heightened vulnerabilities, it was pretty debilitating in a lot of ways. Interestingly, the Democratic Republic of Congo has kind of been touted as one of the largest biodiversity superpowers for climate change and like ameliorating a lot of the effects of climate change and environmental issues. They have a rainforest that is specifically the superpower of biodiversity in Congo. It sucks in more carbon than it releases, basically. So the Democratic Republic of Congo has been a huge source of hope, I guess you could say, in this whole movement of really nurturing biodiversity and valuing and protecting those kinds of natural resources. Yet at the same time, it is one of the most financially poor countries in the world. There's an extreme portion of the population that are in need and vulnerable to a lot of different areas of violence and negative health outcomes. The government has been through various conflicts over the past few decades. And so it's in this very precarious position of having a lot of struggle as a country and yet being touted as one of the beacons of biodiversity. But yeah, so it's really interesting to look at that contrast and then to dive a little bit deeper into what's going on presently. The DRC basically brought up their concern about not having the funds required for what COP15 was asking for and what that agreement was asking for. Which, when you think about it, if you're looking at protecting certain regions, certain natural resources, and everything else, like you want to focus on these like extremely precious resources, these beacons of hope, basically, that have quote unquote been untouched hypothetically by industrialism and capitalism and everything else that's going on in the world. And at the same time, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is entertaining ideas to continue deforestation, to have basically companies come in and drill for oil and all those other things in order to further develop their economy, to provide jobs for the people and get itself in a more stable place. And yet that has been part of the reason why it's received so much backlash, is because they are potentially going to jeopardize that, valuable natural resource of biodiversity in order to bring in a lot of these destructive practices and enterprises into this region. So that's been a concern for activists within the areas, but also within like places like COP or other environmentally focused bodies to kind of stem this from occurring. And yet you have the economic needs of the country that is causing them to entertain these opportunities. So that's just some of the contrast and conflicting realities that are going on that have kind of like I guess hopefully contextualize some of what went down at COP15, because those different dynamics have caused a lot of rife and struggle with other countries and activist groups and everything else, while balancing the need of like finances in order to protect these biodiverse superpowers of nature and then also like building and developing a more stable economy, which not to justify their means for doing that, but if you're one of the most financially and economically poor countries in the world, then, you know, having some of the richest countries in the global north wagging their finger at you is pretty insulting in my perspective.
Right. This is really interesting also because this hasn't been like the first time, of course, that finance and especially when it comes to justifying the continued use of fossil fuels or the exploration for new fossil fuels to finance things. Because, for example, last year at COP26, so the main climate change conference, the language for like they were coming to this agreement to phase out the use of coal in countries like and to assign on to this because coal is really terrible for the environment, even worse than like the burning of just gasoline in your car and stuff like that. It's not as widespread as far as I know, but it's like very very toxic and terrible. But China, India, and some other developing countries who are saying, oh, we're not quite at the same level of development as the developed countries, so like the US, Norway, England, places like this, who've relied on fossil fuels like coal and other things historically, they fought to change the language to phase down instead of phase out. So a reduction rather than a complete elimination, basically because of finance reasons, because they're saying, well, if we're not allowed to use fossil fuels, renewable energy and other things are more expensive, at least right now. And so we won't be able to achieve the same level of development. And to a certain extent, except perhaps I would say, in my opinion, more convincing, that's kind of the situation being faced with the Democratic Republic of Congo right now, because they're saying, you're expecting us to achieve all of these environmental goals and protect these areas, these super diverse areas, but you're not giving us the resources to do so. And historically, like the Congo was especially like one of the really hard hit countries as a colony when it was a colony by Belgium. There was like some very terrible things happened there under King Leopold. So it's like a country that has its a very very negative history of from colonialism and violence and exploitation, things like this. So it's not like, entirely surprising to see them say like, okay, you need to like give us more money, you need to do these things because of all the other strifes that you laid out as well that's currently facing the country. Because there's, a certain extent of where you have to get yourself sorted out, you have to get the country sorted out in order to be able to achieve these conservation goals. And to actually, put these things into practice, you need to have a stable state, you need to have like people sign on to the project. Because if people are saying, I literally can't feed myself, then what's the point of protecting the rich biodiversity of the country if you can't feed yourself, for example? So there's a lot of convincing arguments about like people's actually on the ground reality, and like the necessity for rich northern western countries to provide more funding so these countries can, like, so we can protect the most biodiverse places in the world, which is also something that rings true a lot with the Amazon forest, especially, even though it's mostly like rich loggers and rich multinational companies that are profiting from this. If there's more funding provided for workers and there's less of a need to act like, there would be a lot less incentive to cut down the Amazon forest, for example, which is also one of the more biodiverse places in the world.
And it was a major topic of discussion in the pre-COP meeting that also happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo about the richer nations paying for the harms that they're producing. So one thing that I read from Reuters, climate talks in Kinshasa called out rich nations for failing to honor a $100 billion per year funding pledge to developing countries in order to kind of remedy the environmental harms that they themselves cause. So there was discussion and debate around the responsibility of the richer nations. So, like the G20, for example, is responsible for 80% of the pollution in the world, and that should also be reflected in the responsibilities that are delegated. And G20 stands for Group of 20, which is an intergovernmental forum comprising 19 countries and the European Union. So I thought it would be helpful to define. But yeah, that was a major topic of discussion.
What was the country that dropped out? Because you said 19 countries, right? But it's the G20.
19 countries and the European Union.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, so just there is recognition and debate around the lack of checks and balances and the lack of appropriate responsibility between polluters and then those that are then having to ameliorate the pollution and then to also create these environmental protections. So yeah, I just find that also to be an interesting and important topic to highlight because during COP15, supposedly there was a statement. Let's see, when I was researching, there was an article from France 24 that said wealthier nations, the largest polluters, rejected the call to push a mechanism that would account for damages caused by climate changes to wealthier nations. And then the participants agreed to instead open a quote unquote dialogue on financing damages. So I don't know about you, but opening a dialogue is very encouraging to me. So that's happening, y'all. That's happening.
Dialogue.
You got to open the dialogue,
Exactly.
recognizing admitting the problem.
So we're starting our research, our self investigation to figure out what the problems are. Then we're gonna have a conversation about them, and then we're gonna tell people what they need to do to solve these problems, rather than solve the problem.
In reality, we probably have the discussion and then realize we need even more data.
True, Jay. Yeah, that's
so then
true.
we have to go back and do more research and then have another discussion to open that dialogue for the more research that we've done. And then
this will take like 25 years, and climate change will definitely not get worse by then.
It'll wait for us. It'll wait.
It'll wait for us. Yeah.
We say, as in Kansas, there's a wind chill of like negative 30 degrees.
Jesus Christ, I haven't been outside at all for like the past 2 days because you could get frostbite in literally like 60 seconds, apparently, if you're not properly dressed, which is fucking insane. So.
Yeah. I would not go outside if I did not have to take my dog out, and she despises it.
Yeah.
But yeah, supposedly it's the coldest time, like coldest couple of days in winter Kansas has had in like 30 or 40 years. Right on the heels of COP27, whatever the numbers.
Yes, COP27 and COP15, which is not confusing at all because, they're two different conferences and they have different numberings, whatever. I don't know why they don't call them different things. But
that would make it too easy.
Yeah.
And that's why they don't.
And then people could, track it and then be like, hey, why are they not doing this? Like, what is going on?
And understand what's going on and what the difference between them are. Yeah, whatever. Not important.
Yeah. Also, I keep thinking about like France literally requiring Haiti to pay them money because of the Haitian Revolution that also ended slavery in Haiti. Like it was like started by the slaves in Haiti. And then France was like, hey, pay us this amount of money that we lost because we don't have slaves anymore. But these wealthy countries can't afford to pay. Like all of the places that they've impacted with colonialism that they're wanting their help on for like climate change reform and all of that stuff. It's just so wild to me. So wild.
Right, that's the thing. It's like it's so weird to me that like obviously the rich and wealthy like see themselves still in these cases as exceptional. Like I think in the past people are saying, "Oh, climate change is going to be like the great equalizer, like it's affecting everyone." But the really big issue with that though is unfortunately because it is affecting the most marginalized and poor people of society first because they're being oppressed and they're being placed in worse environmental conditions, economic conditions, all these things, then still like all the elite rich people think they're going to be saved. They have a sanctuary. They're not going to be affected by these things at least during their lifetimes.
One thing to circle back, going to the moment of dissent from the DRC within COP15, one of the articles I read, this one was from The Guardian, mentioned that despite the last minute holdout on creating new biodiversity funds, the DRC advocated for more money to pay for conservation on alternative livelihoods, which is an interesting path to follow with the conflict around them allowing oil and gas companies to come and do all their nastiness. Anyway, one of the statements in the article was, many say this is a disingenuous negotiating tactic designed to get as much money as possible from the global north. And I find that statement to be very curious in how it characterizes some of the perspectives that were likely there at COP27 or no, COP15. Sorry. But yeah, it has a very like punching down vibe to me and just like victim blaming, and how a lot of times any accounts of someone from a marginalized community is seen as like less objective than those that are in power. So this idea of like richer and more powerful nations of the global north like being suspect of the DRC's dissent by saying that, oh, they're just groveling for more money. They're trying to pressure us to pay them more.
I mean, even if that's freaking true, like that's not a bad thing. Like seriously, I would seriously encourage like uh anybody to use underhanded tactics. Like, I think that's one way of like privately resisting, like I guess on this scale, on a wide scale, like resisting capitalism, resisting the oppression by the richest people in the world. Like even in your everyday life, like it might seem like a small thing, but like it's at least psychologically and spiritually, like I guess fulfilling to like have these underhanded tactics. I wouldn't call them necessarily like they're not underhanded. I guess they're just playing the system, and
Yeah,
that's exactly what the big elites are doing anyway. So
but that's the thing is like they're not entirely playing the system because they don't have the power to play the system.
yeah,
Like
hmm
that is, I think, the point of collapse with the more powerful countries sitting there being like, oh, this is disingenuous. They're just trying to manipulate this into their favor. When, like, in actuality, yes, all the countries likely are. But at the same time, this country and those that are linking arms with it, essentially, even if they're not stating it vocally, from the perspective of these countries being like, oh, this is just a disingenuous negotiating tactic. I don't know. I just find it inappropriate, and it like just echoes all these other excuses that we make when we're not recognizing the power structures that are in place and the imbalances and disproportionalities that exist in our society and in the globe more generally. Is this idea of the person that isn't on the same status of us is trying to manipulate us and exploit us, when it's like, in actuality, looking at things, they're kind of fighting for more of a fair ground in the grand scheme of things, but it's us that are in power that are viewing this as like them trying to exploit us, and then we get to be the victims.
I feel like the like people in power being the victims is a very it feels like a very common move that people in power or with privilege are doing nowadays, of like white people and cis people and just a whole bunch of
White replacement theory.
yeah or like like the
yikes.
concept of reverse racism and everything, like this idea that actually it's the people in power that are being discriminated against and everything, which I feel like is very apt for a lot of discussions about like cancel culture that happen like in the mainstream, especially on Fox News and stuff like that. But I don't know, preparing myself to go home to family discussions.
Yeah. And I came across something really interesting, and I'm trying to find the name. Yeah, the name of the source is Populism as an Act of Storytelling, Analyzing the Climate Change Narratives of Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg as Populist Truth Tellers. This comes from Johan Nordesvard and Marcus Katola. But basically, they compared and found that like the rhetoric and the basic narrative framing used by like Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump was actually quite close. And the main sort of trope was the fear of elites acting against your interest and leading you down the wrong path towards doom. So basically, I think it's really interesting that in this day and age that like, Donald Trump as an elite, as one of, the wealthiest people in the US and everything, all this power and everything. But basically, it's saying like playing on the anxieties of the poor country voters, rural voters in the US who still have way more privilege than so many people throughout the entire world because of their race and position, where they're born, their citizenship, all of these things, and fearing the cabal of liberal elites who are, trying to steal their tax dollars and steal their money for climate change, which is something that, after all, doesn't exist. Wink, wink. But yeah.
If it existed, why is it so cold outside?
That's a knee slapper.
Checkmate, liberals. Yeah, I just thought it was also really fascinating that in their analysis they found, and I think that's, for me, that's just also something that we have to pay attention to. Being on, not being climate deniers, I guess, is that a lot of the rhetoric does still kind of play onto the fear of elites acting against your interest and down the wrong path, which is like true, but also not something where, I don't know, like it's not productive in some cases.
Yeah, and there's also you also have to be wary of the anti-Semitism that can also be combined with discussing the elites, and
exactly,
and that's especially present in conspiracy theories. Yeah, I don't have more than that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for actually drawing that out, because I think that makes what I was trying to say a lot better. Basically, it's like this isn't a way of leading towards necessarily generating solutions or something. It's like identifying the problem. I think there's a lot of, obviously there is value in naming and blaming and shaming, but the point is also to the Democratic Republic of Congo, who is calling for material, like not just saying this is your fault, but they're saying, okay, this is how we can feasibly actually generate solutions and start creating solutions to this problem. It's, we need you to do your part, at least as I understand it. They weren't blaming the rich northern, global north, western countries, but they're saying, hey, we need your help, because if we don't, then we won't be able to achieve these things that is better for the entire world. So,
and I don't want to sit here and praise the DRC, because obviously there's a lot of conflict in everything that's going on, and I don't want to portray them as a faultless victim or anything like that. But at the same time, I think the point to get at is like recognizing this positioning of them within COP15 or within this encounter.
So we've been talking a lot about COP27 and COP15, the outcomes of these conferences, what they mean or don't mean for real world consequences for people on the ground. And it might be useful to take a step back and look at Latour, because a lot of his work was about the overlap and the connections or the divides that we have artificially put up between sociology, climate, like science related issues, politics, things like this. He talks about divides, the internal great divide between nature and culture, and the external divides between Westerners and pre-modern culture, and as well as the divides between, like I said, science, politics, and sociology, the social spheres, where he sees these as connected. And a lot of his work with actor network theory and his work on science and technology studies was about sort of bridging these gaps and saying everything that, like, our scientific knowledge that we produce is both influenced and influences the social side of things, the political side of things. So we can't take any of these for granted. Applying this to COP maybe a little bit would be to say that, like, you can see with the 30 by 30 plan, the plan to set aside 30% of the world's area and ocean area by 2030 is directly inspired by the work of the biologist E.O. Wilson, who was an American biologist who popularized the idea of setting aside half the Earth for conservation, because, in his words, basically setting aside half of the Earth would allow for 85% of the world's current biodiversity to survive, and would be a great step towards protecting the world and mitigating climate change and the impacts of environmentalism, especially in terms of biodiversity. What's interesting is that this plan doesn't necessarily specify which half. He talks about the use of technology and things to map out which halves would be most important to protect the most biodiverse regions, things like this. But there's a lot of interesting assumptions that are put into this, because in his ideas for the half Earth, I guess, hypothesis or half Earth plan is to rely on technology and capitalism to drive solutions to make our livings more efficient, and so that basically he talks a lot about how over time capitalism and increasing technology has made things more efficient, so each person requires less land area, and less materials in order to live, which of course isn't true for a lot of the Western global North countries, because they have extremely high consumption rates, which is driven by capitalism, which is something that E.O. Wilson doesn't really account for. He basically holds up the idea of scientific and technological progress for basically furthering our species and allowing us to develop these solutions to climate change, and to basically continue with the current systems and ideas we have, but just to reshape them through solutions produced through COP and through other conferences like this, which don't really, in my opinion, strike at the heart of the issues causing this, that we've been talking about, like colonialism, capitalism, and the historical connections between these and other things.
I also I find myself always wary of conservation ideas that are like, let's set aside this segment of land for these things. I mean, the National Park Service and a lot of the other, like the U.S. Forest Service, and kind of the BLM, but mostly the National Park Service, are kind of like these conservation, let's set aside this land for conservation, and also tourism ideas. Is that I think a lot of these factors don't consider Indigenous perspectives, and like Indigenous land, because, I mean, the NPS originally started out as like stealing, and going against treaties that we had with Indigenous tribes. Like, I love Mesa Verde, but it was founded by stealing Mountain Ute tribal land. And so it always concerns me to see these kind of ideas and like so solutions, because it doesn't feel like they consider the people that are the most marginalized by climate change, and also the people who have been doing the most work, and the most communication with the earth.
I think we also should be attentive here to the human-centric and supremacist ways in which these solutions and efforts are being talked about. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in academia around like more than human theories, like multi-species and interspecies theories, and a whole branch of animal studies. But like, these are also understandings and practices that a lot of Indigenous communities have held over generations. But yeah, I think it's important to discuss how we are putting humans on a pedestal here as the ones that drive solution and that bring about these changes that the world is going to need, when in fact we're the ones that cause the problems in the first place. And I think a really important step to take is to practice humility in recognizing these systems that we've created of capitalism, communism, of extraction and energy production, and all these other things are reasons why we're in the state that we're in. And it's kind of the Audre Lorde quote of, you can't dismantle the master's house with a master's tools. And we need to recognize that a lot of the efforts that are going on are very single issue focused. And for example, all the trips going to coral reefs or to Antarctica to study climate change and melting glaciers and such are also producing a lot of pollution in the air and noise pollution in the ocean that are negatively affecting whales' mating habits and mating practices and so on and so forth. And there's just an extreme amount of ripple effect that we're not considering when we're talking about these issues in a single issue lens. And Bathsheba Demuth wrote a book that I really enjoyed reading last year called Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, where she discussed different indigenous communities, different colonizing groups that came in both from Russia and from the US to, extract goods from these areas. And she talks about not only is it important to trace human narratives and human events going on, but also being cognizant of the natural history and the ways in which whales and seals and glaciers and all these other things were very important agents in what went on historically in the Bering Strait. So she talks about like how important whales were, not just for the indigenous communities that hunted them, but also for the ocean life. She gave the example of when a whale dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, which brings about an abundance of nutrients to these organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean that they normally don't get. So it's just wealth of life in these areas. And then you have this capitalist production coming into the Bering Strait and then the intense whale hunting that went on, and it kind of shifts the entire environment and ecosystem in these areas. So recognizing that, any ways in which we're taking human action is also going to bring about harm and violence in various ways. And that it's important to decenter the human in these conversations, not only because the human has been such a fraught construct that has been a tool of oppression, but also to recognize that the earth is just fine without humans. Like, we need to practice some humility in recognizing that the earth has what it needs, and the earth has knowledge, and the land has knowledge and vitality. And a lot of times just stepping out of the way is the action that humans need to take.
There's whales off the coast of Iceland, and a lot of the current day conversations is about there's some Icelandic people who want to continue hunting the whale because it's like a traditional practice supposedly in Iceland. But I think what's really interesting though is a lot of the reason why I think people are defending the whale today and seeing the whale as like this certain, there's all these species that are chosen as like these carriers of affect, and saying oh, we should protect the pandas, we should protect these species because they're unique or stand out in some way. And for the whale, this is really driven by tourism and whale tourism, like whale spotting and tours in Iceland, because that's a big thing to go on a whale tour and whale watching tour. And I think this is kind of why the whale has picked up an image. So for me, this opens up conversations about the motivations behind conservation of whales, or just even more generally of things like, why are we doing this? The point isn't necessarily, shouldn't be, in my opinion, for tourism, although this can be a interesting vector to explore. My thing is just, I think it can go really fall out of hand if you rely on tourism and finance and economic packages and things like this as the main driver for conservation and environmentalism. And I think that's a lot of the problems I have with the proposed 30 by 30 and Wilson's 50% of Earth's plan, is that it doesn't always have the right reasonings for conservation or for environmental protections at hand. It's not to say let's protect the vulnerable people and species of the world. It's to say, how can we continue exploiting these by stretching out their lifespans a little bit longer, having them last a little bit longer, so we can extract as much profit out of them as possible.
I think we should always be wary of this idea of like, let's set aside this portion of the earth for conservation, because how are you going to do that? Like, who is, just makes me wary.
Well, if we use technology to make the decisions, it will be unbiased and objective.
You know that's not true.
Right.
You know that's not true.
Exactly.
And who creates those technologies?
Yeah, exactly. We're getting all postmodern. And what's really interesting also, Latour talks about the divide between what he calls the non-moderns. So in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, basically he redefines the Western world as never being modern, and he calls us non-moderns. And we're characterized by daringness, innovativeness, youthful excesses, freedom of society liberated from objects, in contrast to the pre-moderns, who are the non-Western, non-developed countries, and they're known for, in his world, in his words, his eyes, for excessive self-control, limits on experimentation, restrictions on freedom of maneuver. And it's kind of interesting to see the sort of connections between Latour and Wilson in this case, because obviously daring, innovativeness, youthful excesses, freedom of society, kind of is basically what is valued by capitalism, and is definitely like can seem strongly shaping the discourse and outcomes of conferences like COP, the two COPs that happened this year, for example. As interesting as it is, like in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, Latour introduces the idea of a parliament of things. And they actually did a real life parliament of things, which basically had, I believe it was students, they had different students stand in for like non-human things. So there was basically a human representative for the sun, for soil, for different plant species, different animal species, in order to sort of have like these Congress or COP like procedures, where the soil would have a say about, I want this, I want to be protected these ways, but like the Parliament of Things, as interesting and as good as it is for a thought experiment, it still kind of has this anthropocentric vibe of like saying, like having this optimism or this overconfidence that humans can speak for these non-human relations. And I think that's what the inspiration of behind so many of the new materialist thinkers and object-oriented ontology and these thinkers, is to push against this a little bit, because Latour's project is about, he talks about half of our projects is constructed in science and technology, the other half of nature is constructed in societies, and his idea is that we can connect these two realms together again, and the political task can begin. So he's basically saying that like through this sort of accounting for the what he calls the sort of pre-modern character of nature, and the other, which includes like indigenous subjects and non-Western civilizations, we can still use the language of technology and science to develop solutions together to climate change, which still misses completely the point and a lot of the causes for climate change and environmental related disasters in the first place. So I think that's a very valid and strong criticism of Latour that he really never addresses.
I think it's really poignant to mention just how, like Cody was talking about, how a lot of people, especially older people, especially older white people, and just kind of Western nations, want to think about how our climate change reaction should be rational. But I think it's something that most young people understand, is that like most of us have a sense of like existential dread about the future because of climate change that we've just kind of grown up with. Because for many of us, we learned about climate change and the potential effects and damages of it from such a young age. I mean, I remember learning about it in depth in 8th grade, which is like 13, 14 for people that are not from the United States. But I think it's really important to remember that like climate change is not really something that we can be neutral or passive or rational about, because of the effects that it is already currently having on people's lives. and the places that they live and their livelihoods.
It's really important to highlight the work of young people, the energy that young people have put into environmentalism protests and climate change protests, and especially with, I love the examples of what I call the souping of the paintings of the Van Gogh paintings and the reaction to them and stuff, and saying, "Oh my God, how could you soup the paintings?" But I think it's just kind of emblematic, like talking about COP, of the failures of the older generations for actually producing this radical action to do what we need to do when we need to do it to achieve these things for the young people's future. Because like I think for me it comes down a lot to affect and emotion, and seeing that and valuing that rather than just trying to think about these things in a watered down rational political way, because it's about people's lives. It's about these things that we can't reduce to numbers and statistics. It's about their lived experiences, accounting for that, taking into account their needs, in order to uplift them and everything. And I think what's really inspiring and interesting about the young like environmentalist protests, it's overlaps kind of with Occupy and the alter globalization movements. And there's this great quote from David Graeber, talking about the alter globalization movement, where he says it's about creating and acting horizontal networks instead of top-down structures like states, parties, or corporations. Networks based on principles of decentralized, non-hierarchical, consensus democracy, which is more of what we need, because COP and these other conferences are supposed to be, democratic and more egalitarian, and putting these countries on the same sort of footing so that each can have input and decide what needs to be done. But clearly that's not the case, and young people can play a strong role in fighting against the capitalist and non-democratic and frankly quite like bordering on fascist and authoritarian ways and manifestations that the like continuing spearheading and of capitalism and exploitation and colonialism has taken on in these days. So it's up for us to like really lean into the effective energies and real world experience and lived experience of so many people in order to fight for our futures and for their futures. So,
and I think that's also why it's important to not just remember to listen to young people, but also to remember to listen to Indigenous young people, people from colonized places, or places that had been colonized around the world, and young people who are currently experiencing the like effects that climate change will eventually have on the global north and the imperialist and colonial institutions that have forever changed these nations and these people's like lives and futures. And I just think it's important to remember when we're continuing to think about solutions to climate change that things like COP27 and COP15 can feel and be just kind of performative solutions or performative political actions by nations to seem like they're coming up with solutions. But in order to actually come up with a solution to climate change, radical and structural change would need to exist globally and not just within the United States. And there is no way you're going to get all of these nations and people in power to agree to a radical change like that would actually be a solution to climate change. And that's why I think that going forward, we need to take like agreements and discussions like these as solutions as a grain of salt. They can say more, though, about the larger political state of the world and especially of these imperialist Western countries. And then I would just kind of like finally wrap it up by like just reminding people to listen to Indigenous voices. I think that they're going to be the way of the future and the solutions to climate change. And I just think that we need to really break out of our like epistemologies of like white epistemologies and how we're thinking about the earth and climate change and all of those things, and that Indigenous people are thinking about it in a much more advanced and complex way than we have ever been thinking about the earth and our relation to the earth.
I think that's definitely a great point. Thanks for listening from all of us at Unlivable Cultures. This is Cody signing out.